Okay, so you want to take a deep dive into the kind of stuff that's got those U.S. security folks all worked up, right?
Stuff that keeps them up at night.
Exactly. Well, we're diving deep into two reports. One is the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency's 2024 Worldwide Threat Assessment.
Which is always a fun read.
And the other is called Cyber Attacks on U.S. Infrastructure from June 2024. Now, let me tell you, they really don't sugarcoat it. The DIA report actually calls the current global situation one of, get this, unprecedented severe challenges.
Yeah, I mean, they really want to get your attention with that phrase, and with good reason. We're not talking about your run-of-the-mill global hiccups here, right? It's the sheer magnitude, the way these threats are all tangled up, that really makes this moment feel different.
It's like everything's happening all at once, right? You've got China flexing its muscles in the Pacific.
Trying to rewrite the rules.
Russia's still going at it in Ukraine.
It has really upended things.
Iran's busy causing trouble in the Middle East. And of course, you always got to keep an eye on North Korea. They're always up to something.
It's definitely not a quiet time in geopolitics, that's for sure. And it's not just the sheer number of hot spots, but how they all play off each other. For instance, the whole situation with Russia and Ukraine, that's really cemented that bond between Russia and China. They're working together on the military and economic fronts, basically giving the finger to that U.S.-led world order that's been around for, well, a good while now.
Yeah, so maybe not Cold War 2.0 exactly, but definitely feels like those old rivalries are heating back up again. And speaking of rivalries, this DIA report, it pulls no punches when it comes to China. They call China the, quote, pacing security challenge for the U.S., which honestly sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah, pacing is definitely a word they chose carefully. It's not just about how many guns and tanks they have, although they've been busy on that front too. Their Navy alone has grown by like 9% just since last year.
Whoa.
It's about their economic clout, their tech game, and their long-term goals. China's actively trying to weaken those U.S. alliances, especially over there in the Indo-Pacific.
And then there's the whole Taiwan situation, which feels like, I don't know, a ticking time bomb or something. Can you break down why China is so obsessed with Taiwan and what would actually happen if things kicked off over there?
Sure. So the simplest way to put it is that China sees Taiwan as part of its territory that just, well, wandered off, like some unfinished business from their civil war way back when. And they haven't ruled out using force to bring Taiwan back into the fold.
And the fallout from that would be?
Oh, a conflict over Taiwan would be bad. Really bad. I mean, first off, you've got the human cost, a war in that region, unthinkable. But it goes way beyond that. You see, Taiwan's a major player in the semiconductor game. Those tiny chips that are in everything these days, right? Phones, cars, even advanced weapons systems. War breaks out, the supply chains get disrupted, the tech industry could grind to a halt, and you'd probably see other big powers getting dragged in.
It's like this domino effect. No one wants to get involved, but then suddenly everyone's in the thick of it.
Exactly. And it's not just about what China says it wants, it's how they've been acting. Like that surveillance balloon they flew over the U.S. back in January, that was unnerving, to say the least.
And then that near miss with the U.S. Air Force B-52.
Exactly. These incidents, plus the fact that they just abruptly removed some top brass in the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, it makes you wonder about their command and control, you know?
Which is a little unnerving considering they're also rapidly building up their nuclear arsenal. The DIA report says they could have over 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030.
Not to mention the strides they're making in space. They're developing what they call counter-space weapons, which are basically designed to take out satellites.
Satellites, as in the ones we rely on for, well, pretty much everything.
Communication, navigation, even intelligence gathering were very reliant on satellites. Imagine a conflict breaks out and boom, the U.S. loses its eyes and ears in space. Talk about a game changer, and not in a good way.
Yeah, that's a whole other level of scary. But before we really dive into the doomsday scenarios here, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another battlefield where the stakes are incredibly high cyberspace.
Right, and that brings us to that second report, the one about critical infrastructure here in the U.S. being vulnerable to cyber attacks. We're talking about the power grid, water treatment plants, transportation, all that fun stuff that keeps the lights on and the water running.
And these aren't just hypothetical what-if scenarios, are they? That report talks about some pretty unsettling real-world attacks that have already happened.
Yeah, like that whole thing with those Iranian hackers, the ones who hit those U.S. water systems a while back. Right, from earlier this year. They got into, like, A bunch of water facilities even replaced some of the operational data with anti-Israel messages.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a whole thing. Luckily, they didn't actually screw up the water supply itself, but still, talk about a wake-up call, you know? Showed how vulnerable we really are.
Yeah, for sure. And then there was that other case, I think it was back in June, with the pro-Russia hackers messing with water and dairy facilities.
Oh, yeah. They were in the system, remotely controlling things, even caused some overflows in those water tanks. Just goes to show these attacks, they can have real-world physical consequences.
That's not just theoretical. Yeah.
Not at all. And it's not like you can just, patch a couple lines of code and call it a day. These systems, we call them industrial control systems, ICSs for short. They're super complex, often running on old software. Not a lot of resources for security. You know how it is.
I got to admit, I never really thought about, a water treatment plant being vulnerable to a cyber attack.
That's the thing, right? Back in the day, these systems were designed to be isolated, but we're all about interconnectedness now, so those gaps, they've disappeared. So many of these critical infrastructure systems, they're online in some way, which opens up a whole can of worms, security-wise.
Makes sense.
And because these ICSs, they're often managing physical processes, a successful attack. We're talking contaminated water, disrupted food supplies, even blackouts. It's not just data theft anymore. It's about potentially shutting down entire cities, regions even.
Okay, that's kind of terrifying, not going to lie.
Yeah.
But before I go full-on doomsday prepper, let's talk solutions. The report mentions cybersecurity best practices and all that, but realistically, is that enough? I mean, people are still using password 123 out there.
You're preaching to the choir here. Awareness is huge, right? The more people understand what's at stake, the more likely they are to actually do those basic things like strong passwords, two-factor authentication, and honestly, a little healthy paranoia never hurt anyone in the digital age. You know what I mean?
So maybe not a bad idea to be a little more careful about what we're clicking on, what info we're sharing online.
Exactly. Every click, every download, every time you go online, it's like opening a door, digitally speaking. You don't want to just open the door to any hacker who comes knocking, right?
Solid analogy. So to bring it all back to our listeners, what's the main takeaway here? We've painted a pretty bleak picture. Global instability, cyber threats, but it's not all doom and gloom, right?
Not at all. The point is, we're not helpless here. Knowledge is power, and understanding the threats, well, that's step one in dealing with them. Both these reports, they stress how important it is to be adaptable, to realize the old playbook, it doesn't cut it anymore.
So less cowboy diplomacy, more smart diplomacy, especially now that it's not just the U.S. calling the shots on the world stage.
Exactly. Building alliances, understanding different cultures, different political systems, and being strategic about how we use our power. It's complicated, but it's the name of the game now.
And part of that is understanding how stuff that's happening halfway across the world can still have a real impact closer to home, right?
Oh, absolutely. Remember how we were talking about Taiwan and those semiconductors? Say a factory over there gets hit with a cyber attack, production shuts down. Next thing you know, you can't get the latest smartphone. Or even worse, essential medical equipment is suddenly unavailable. What happens over there, it can ripple out and touch our lives in very real ways.
That's a really good point. Okay, so we've talked about all these complex global challenges. What can the average person actually do? It's easy to feel overwhelmed, right? Like, what difference can I actually make?
I get that. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of these massive issues, but honestly, I think it all comes back to knowledge. These reports, as heavy as they are, they're full of useful stuff. Both of them highlight resources like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. They've got tons of info on mitigating cyber threats. And then there's the CDC, always a good resource for health-related concerns.
Right, so it's about arming ourselves with information, being proactive about our own digital security, staying informed.
Exactly. It's about being aware, not freaking out. Think about it this way. We don't just learn about crossing the street safely once and then that's it, right? We build those habits looking both ways, paying attention. Cybersecurity, global awareness, it's kind of the same deal.
It's about building those good habits, yeah. No need to go full-on bunker mode just yet, but maybe it's time to finally change that default password. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Just because the future is uncertain doesn't mean it's all doom and gloom. It just means we need to be ready to adapt, to stay informed, to be engaged.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Big thanks to you for joining us for this deep dive. We've covered a lot, from China's ambitions and cyber threats to why it's so important to stay informed and proactive. If you're feeling curious, and I hope you are, check out the reports yourself. We'll link them in the show notes. Until next time, Stay curious, stay safe, and keep asking the tough questions.